So today I have the wonderful opportunity to speak to someone whose actions and voice on matters of the environment, of land and sea, and all the work this fellow has done is so important. Today I'm speaking with Terry Tamminen. Terry, in January 2022, was appointed President and CEO of AltaSea at the Port of Los Angeles. And of course, I'll ask Terry to explain all about that as we dive in. In 2016, Terry was named CEO of the Leonardo DiCaprio Foundation. He was Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger's Secretary of California EPA. Terry helped Schwarzenegger to found the R20 Region's Climate Action. In 2008, The Guardian ranked Terry #1 in its top 50 people who can save the planet. In 2007, Terry was named Vanity Fair's Environmental Hero. Terry is founder and president of the nonprofit Seventh Generation Advisors. He is a writer on the climate, environment, and Shakespeare, which would be interesting to hear about that. Terry was born in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and spent much of his youth in Australia. So, Terry, thank you for being with us today and being part of the spotlight. Since McTigue is an architecture and design and planning studio, and we practice what I've called conscious architecture, my questions for you lean towards the built environment. So I hope that's okay with you.
Absolutely.
So welcome here today.
Thank you.
So Terry, the obvious or very simplistic question for someone like you who has done so much and is doing so much, what gets you up in the morning? What's the motivation?
Well, kidding aside, it really is the sense of urgency around what's happening to our planet, and particularly climate change, of course. Each successive report from the UN's Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change keeps reminding us how much closer we're getting to points of no return. And we're seeing what life could be like if we do make that point of no return, whether it's greater wildfires that run out of control now 12 months out of the year in many places, whether it's more extreme storms that are more frequent and more destructive. We've just seen unprecedented tornadoes for this time of year in the South and Midwest of the United States. And of course, all over the world, we're seeing massive impacts of climate change already being felt. So it's that sense that we've got very, very few years to turn this thing around, to have a sustainable life on this planet. And the Guardian newspaper said I was one of the people who could save the planet. I'm not trying to save the planet. I'm trying to save our quality of life on this planet. And like I said, that's getting harder by the day.
That's brilliant, and it reminds you of the old story that the planet will save itself. It might be radically different, but it's not so much the planet as it is our quality of life, and really all life on this planet, how we all interact. That's really what's fragile. Yeah.
It is indeed. Something like 99+% of all the plant and animal species ever to exist on Earth came and disappeared before the advent of industrial humans. So that sort of evolution extinction is normal, and we're accelerating it, of course, for many species. But the planet doesn't care if we're here.
No, so true. Well, your life has really, it sounds like, begun with this issue from a young kid. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
Well, I think, like a kid in Milwaukee, growing up in the 50s and 60s, I probably wasn't different from any other kid. I don't think I was more or less aware of nature in general. And although I did watch the Jacques Cousteau documentaries about the undersea world, and I was fascinated by Wild Kingdom and all the nature shows that were on TV in those days, and wanted to be like those people going out into nature, and particularly in the ocean. So when I had the chance to actually have a career doing that, protecting the ocean in the Santa Monica Bay in Los Angeles, and planting kelp to restore the actual ecosystem that we had damaged with pollution and other degradation, I jumped at that. I was in my mid-40s, and maybe it was my midlife crisis, starting a nonprofit, the Santa Monica Baykeeper. And but I got to go to work in a boat every day, busting polluters and having those kinds of adventures. And then And then, like I said, planting kelp. And so now it's really exciting to come full circle at AltaSea, where the kelp is being planted by scientists, and we're learning that we can extract food and fuel and pharmaceuticals and many things that will save the quality of our life on this planet. Little did I know, I thought back in those days I was just planting underwater trees for the 800 species that giant kelp off the coast of California depend on.
So you saw it in that micro environment back then. You probably, I imagine you had there was something in you, I suspect, that saw the bigger picture always. I just have the feeling about you, but you were acting at that very concentrated level, let's say.
Well, I will say that, I think traveling helped me because my parents gave me a diving certification course off Palos Verdes here in Los Angeles when I was 12. And so that's when I first realized my dream of being the guy from Sea Hunt, Mike Nelson, the character in the black and white TV series. That was another one that inspired me. And so I got my first diving certification, and then my family moved to Australia. I lived in Europe for a while. I came back in my 20s to go to college, Cal State Northridge. And so a decade after my first experience underwater, I went back to those same kelp beds and found they had all disappeared, and learned then that it was because of polluted runoff and other kinds of pollution that we had destroyed them. And that's what made me realize, wow, humans are powerful enough to destroy entire ecosystems. And that's when I started to become a member of Sierra Club and Cousteau Society. And you kind of send your $20 now and then to do your part, but you don't think there's anything you can do. And that's when I learned about the Santa Monica Baykeeper and said, wait a minute, yeah, there is something I can do.
That's great. So you're describing this, I think, this connection, the threads, as I've thought about, of we all have some of that, or maybe a lot of that in our careers, our pathway. You certainly have that. Those threads that lead you to today. Are there other ones that you think of that are, sort of flash moments where you might have shifted from one direction to another?
Well, I call those the put up or shut up moments.
Uh-huh.
And when Arnold Schwarzenegger decided to run for governor, I was running at that point. I had moved from the Santa Monica Baykeeper to Environment Now, which was a foundation created by the late Frank Wells of Disney at the time. He had funded the Baykeeper and wanted me to do more of that kind of work all up and down the state. So I took on the post at Environment Now. And when Arnold decided to run for governor, I approached him with an environmental action plan. It was all the things that the foundation and our various advocacy partners had been telling the state for years that they had to do in terms of conservation and climate solutions and ocean protection and so forth. So we gave him this manifesto, and he was very open to it. People were surprised to learn that he was actually an environmentalist, the guy who smoked cigars and blew up things on television or on the movie screens, was actually a deep environmentalist, but he didn't know the policies. So he welcomed this think tank coming forward with a campaign policy that he could run on. And I'm a Democrat, he's a Republican. So a lot of my friends said, what are you doing? And I said, well, look, we want Republicans to be saying the same things about conservation that we are, because it really is a false choice that you have to give up the environment in order to have a good economy. In fact, it's quite the opposite. So he knew that. So I helped him. And of course, I told my friends, I said, look, don't worry, he's not going to win the election. We just want a Republican saying these things. Well, he won the election. I went into his office the next day and I said, well, congratulations, Governor. I don't think you have any idea what you've bitten off here, but at least you have a great environmental action plan to implement. And he said, no, I don't. You do.
Perfect. He puts you back on the spot.
That's where you put up or shut up, and you realize, all right, I wasn't planning to go into government, but I wrote the plan and he gave me the opportunity. And so that was one of those aha moments. And we went in. If you go back and look at that plan that was published in 2003, we got all of those things done. We protected millions of acres of marine parks, land parks, million solar roofs was launched and achieved. And our Global Warming Solutions Act, our Hydrogen Highway Initiative. I mean, so many other of the things that were in that plan all got done. And then, it was another kind of put up or shut up moment in my life when I got out of government and I was advising a lot of different philanthropists and other governments around the world on how to do what California did, but philanthropists on how to put their money to work effectively. And I met Leonardo DiCaprio, and he said, I've got this foundation and it needs a climate plan, and I need somebody to run it. And again, it was one of those put up or shut up moments. So I helped him build his foundation, and then we merged it later with the Earth Alliance and into something even bigger.
Fantastic. Put up or shut up. We should all be aware of that and live that way, I think. I want to fast forward a little bit to your current role, because I'm very curious about that. And as you know, I've worked with you a bit and come to know a bit about you and your role currently as president and CEO of AltaSea. So tell me about AltaSea. Tell us about AltaSea.
It really seems to be the place that my whole career was leading me to, and I, never quite knew it, because as I mentioned, I was planting kelp 35 years ago. I went into government. I've been in philanthropy, and here's the chance to pull all those things together. It's a nonprofit. AltaSea is a nonprofit that was established 5 or 6 years ago, and the Port of Los Angeles has this 35-acre campus that includes about 250,000 square feet of historic warehouses that were built 100 years ago and are no longer really used because, of course, everything is containers now. And so there's that plus some vacant land that's no longer usable and so on. They dedicated that to AltaSea, the nonprofit, and said, look, you can have this at essentially $1 a year lease if you build an education center about the marine environment and the marine economy, the blue economy, if you help train the future workforce, if you help incubate the businesses that are going to drive the economy and help clean up the ports, particularly air emissions and other things. So if you fulfill this nonprofit mission, you can take over these spaces, but you also have to raise a lot of money and renovate them because they're 100 years old and not up to code. So we've gone on this campaign. We've raised a good bit of money. We're starting the renovation. We, in fact, already just put on a brand new 180,000 square foot roof, and we're putting on 2.2 megawatts of solar, and that'll be done in a couple of months. That's enough to power 700 homes. And then the interior, we've raised the money to renovate the first 60,000 square feet into a modern blue tech incubator campus where researchers can be to discover new things, like I mentioned about kelp as an example, what we can now extract from kelp and how to farm it in different ways. And then the companies that come out of those discoveries that can then build their prototypes, their demonstration models, show policymakers, the public, investors, et cetera. So have this blue tech incubator right here. And then all throughout that, of course, educate K through 12, as well as community college and four-year college students in these careers, and get them ready to make this a really big thing in California.
So you're really crossing all these areas from education to incubation, helping businesses to start and get launched. But it's all based on this, growing, I guess is the word, awareness of the ocean and what it is as a huge, major part of this planet, right? What's there?
Well, that's right. I mean, the Earth is covered 2/3 by ocean, not land. And yet we think of ourselves as land animals. And in fact, I think in the near future, we're going to get much more of our food supply from the ocean. We already do get a lot. In fact, of course, we've strip mined the ocean in some ways in terms of most of the fishing species are no longer sustainable. But now we've started to move that on land, and we've learned more sustainable ways to farm fish and shrimp and other kinds of seafood. One of the programs that we have right here at AltaSea, a company called Holdfast, is experimenting with different ways to grow mussels and other seafood on ropes and then suspend those out in the ocean. We have a 100-acre demonstration farm where they're proving that you don't have to just do it on near shore pilings or like kelp beds on the rocks near shore, things like that. You can grow these seaweeds and these other seafoods out on platforms in the ocean, take advantage of the nutrients in the ocean and the water circulating and so on, the sunlight, in very large quantities. So you're going to see farmers, just like on land, with tractors and planters and all kinds of other mechanized devices, planting and harvesting food and other materials from the ocean in the very near future.
So how does AltaSea is AltaSea in a sense providing the space for those folks, these companies to do that work? What is the interaction between you and your staff, let's say, and those businesses?
Sure. So first and foremost is the research and education piece. So we have the University of Southern California, Dr. Sergey Nushtin, for example, has put about a 15,000 square foot kelp lab. If you come here today, you'll see all of the tanks. There's probably 50 different tanks of bubbling seawater and ultraviolet lights, LED lights shining down. And what he's trying to learn is which of the species of kelp will yield the most oil or the most protein or the most whatever you're trying to get out of it. And then which one grows the best, especially in a changing climate where circumstances might be very different, or in changing habitats, like I said, offshore instead of onshore. So they do that experimentation, and then the PhD students that work on this and the startup companies that want to commercialize these discoveries, then they can take that from the lab right here and go to one of our warehouses and build their prototypes or build tanks and demonstrate what they specifically want to build. Or right offshore of our dock, we have extensive docks in this alongside these warehouses, of course, to build barges and various kinds of aqua farms. And then, as I mentioned, there's one offshore that we work with. So it's a place where the research happens, the education, and then hopefully those discoveries are taken to the next level to actual businesses. And then that means you need new workers. And so there's a whole job training program that's part of that as well, with the community colleges trying to understand what are those businesses going to need in the future. And then they're developing for us various worker certification programs. So you do a couple years of STEM classes in high school, you go to 2 years at a community college with certain courses, and you graduate with a degree, an associate degree in aquaculture or underwater robotics, which is another really exciting thing that we're experimenting with here. And but it all starts with the research and spinning out the intellectual property.
Yeah, all connected. Amazing. Where I have a couple of topics, of course, I would love to talk with you about, and I want to come back around to this, if you don't mind. I'm very curious. So let's come back to AltaSea, but I'm curious about when you talked about the work at the government level, at the state level, let's say, and even further. We as architects are constantly impacted, or we see opportunities, let's say, in the regulatory environment, right? We can look at it as pro or con. Mm-hmm. And I think in California, we tend to have already gotten over the con side of it as designers and engineers and said, this is how we improve the place that we live and work and recreate. So it's good for us, regulation. But what do you see as, let's say, process to create change, to cause change? Do you see that with your experience at, let's say, more at the regulatory end, or at the designer, the user, the sort of end person end of it? Is it highly localized, or is it really at a larger level where we can have the greater impact?
Well, I think you're describing the chicken or the egg problem here, which is, do you innovate and do things, or do you lay the groundwork first? And you really need to do both, because the one thing I can tell you as a former policymaker, and when you look at laws, well-intentioned laws to try to regulate things or incentivize them, that's the other thing. You look for our Million Solar Roofs initiative, for example. We had to understand the realities of the roofing business, of the electrical business, of the construction industry, of union labor, and so on and so forth, before we could put together an incentive program that might work. And of course, also what the utilities would do. What would happen if you had a lot of homes in one area generating solar and trying to send it back to the grid, when the grid is designed to send energy to the homes and in the other direction? Mm-hmm. So you do need a little bit of experience, and you've got to jump into it, but then you do need the regulators to help normalize it or put the incentives or the brakes in the right place. So that's difficult. But when it comes to things like the blue economy, that's why we're excited to be that place where we can experiment with those things in a controlled environment, where we can collaborate with. I'd say our first level of government is actually the Port of Los Angeles, which is owned by the city. And so they're highly regulated, and they kind of help us understand what's needed and what's possible in goods movement and in the marine environment. And then, of course, the city, the county, and then the state. And when you're doing things statewide, of course, then it really gets big, because California is the 5th largest economy on the planet. And very often when we do something, that makes it possible in many other places.
Is this, you just have me thinking about, is what you're describing something that is easily scalable and repeatable? Is it hard? Is there the potential for an AltaSea, in let's say 10 of the places around the world? Is what you're describing something that we can all do if we all know what it is that we're doing?
Yes, and it's interesting. One of our programs here, when you ask how we're going to interact, I mean, like I said, we start with the researchers on site, and then help the companies with space and other, access to markets or regulators or finance and so on. So we're formalizing that into kind of a blue tech incubator program. And we're learning from the 70 other blue tech incubators around the world. We did a survey, and we found that there are 70. Now, they all do very different things. Some have similarities. Some would be similar to what we do. Others are more university kind of courses and things like that, maybe sort of MBA programs with a blue flavor. But there's a lot to learn from out there. And then what we found is that there are others that are already looking to have some kind of standardization of this around the world. So we're about to sign an MOU with AltaSea Rio de Janeiro, and where we'll license the name, the concepts. We've got people that coincidentally in the port of Rio de Janeiro have historic warehouses that the port is willing to give them to renovate. So very, very similar circumstances. We're planning a kind of a network of these particularly port-based blue incubators, because there's so many similarities and needs to not just do things like seafood and water and robotics, but goods movement, clean goods movement. And so we're working with ports in China and in Italy and other places to create a network to share best practices, because that's one thing we found when we discovered these 70 other incubators around the world, that they don't talk to each other. And so let's try to figure out where we can help each other, because I don't really see them as competitive. We have one company, for example, here that has developed some really innovative underwater robots for a variety of uses. And it was a California company, but their big commercial success was in Norway because of the salmon industry there, where the salmon industry wanted these robots to be able to, they're shaped like fish, and they literally swim with the fish in these big open salmon pens, and they can monitor the health of the fish and the health of the ecosystem and so on. And so, if there was an incubator in Norway, we could easily have shared this company with them. And similarly, they've got technologies around the blue economy that want to break into the California and the US market. We have a company here from Israel, EcoWave, that is generating energy from waves in a manner that is much more economical and durable than previous examples of those kinds of companies. And they've been very successful around the Mediterranean, but they want to get into the California market because we're such a leader and driver of clean energy. And they know that there's going to be a need for this, but they don't know where to demonstrate their technology, how to access the regulators, let alone the utilities and the end users. So that's an example of where even a blue tech incubator in Israel, we're not competing with them. It's quite the opposite. We're going to share knowledge and help each other grow. So yeah, I think there is now kind of like clean tech incubators around the world, and lessons to be learned from one jurisdiction to another about how to drive those outcomes and a low carbon economy of the future. It's happening now with blue tech.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So 70 sounds like a very large number, but when you think of so much planet that we've got, you really do need to work. We all need to work together to actually make these kinds of change and to make these connections, create these points of connection and knowledge and info. So architecturally, right, we don't do much on the water itself. We're, architects, we tend to be on the land side of this equation almost invariably. But as I think I've had the pleasure, actually the privilege, to work on over 25 cruise terminals around the world, mostly in the US, but around the world as well. And that fragility of the water's edge is, it was a big deal to what I saw in 2000 or 1999 even. It's much more of a big deal now. And I'm wondering, if you could just talk a little bit about the edge of land and sea, which is where your office actually sits, right there.
Well, yes. And look, with sea level rise and the other changes that are coming because of climate change, I'm sure you and your practice are looking at that when you're designing a building today that might not be built for another 3, 4, 5 years by the time it's permitted and done. And if it's anywhere near the ocean, it's going to be living in a very different environment. I mean, not to mention the land-based impacts of climate change, which I would imagine you're dealing with in your practice as well. Mm-hmm. But I think there's also, once again, planet's covered 2/3 by water, not by land. And we're looking at companies that want to showcase here, one called Oceanics. There's actually 2 others that are looking to create floating cities in the future, modular mm-hmm. floating cities, and I think the first one will probably end up getting built in Hong Kong or in that area, and where there'll be floating housing modules and floating greenhouses for food production and floating industrial centers and so forth. And you can kind of literally move more modules if you need more housing, more industry or warehousing if you need more of that, et cetera, and just let them grow kind of like a city does. Mm-hmm. So I think there's going to be more and more interest in architecture and efficient architecture on water, much as there is on land. And then even things like floating. I mean, we know that because of sea level rise, and especially if some of the worst predictions about the polar ice caps are true, that in the next 50 to 100 years, if not sooner, we could have several feet of sea level rise. And so buildings that maybe are designed to float, even if they're initially put on land, but have some ability to go up into like a dock in a harbor, where it's anchored to pilings that are in the land. So it's a land-based thing essentially, but it floats up and down on the tide. I mean, again, this is where we need guys like you mm-hmm. to innovate based on what we know those changes are that are coming.
Great point. We've seen, and we've been talking with people in primarily Amsterdam, which deals with their water, the edge of their water and land in their own unique ways. And we're talking with them about exactly that. Began as the concept of a floating cruise terminal, which then became a tourism venue, which then became a parking facility for residents or citizens because you're connected to the land, as you said. And that question of how do you do that is right now where the technology process is taking place. How do you really do that? The concept is there. It's achieving it. And I've personally seen in the last 22 years working in Galveston, Texas, on their cruise and port facilities, that they would have the occasional lunar flood to the city of Galveston. And if you go to Galveston, you would know that the curbs in the old town are 14 inches high. They're not 6 inches high. They're extra tall, right? And that's because Galveston as a city always has had a degree of flooding. And the frequency of that happening today in the years that I've worked there is, I want to say it's probably twice as often now in the span of 20 years. Mm. So that's a very real issues, right? From a point of view of, do we build a city like Galveston or Miami, again, in these locations, or where do we put them? So fascinating stuff. And I want to, so I could talk with you a lot about, building material and how that relates to what research is happening in the ocean. We deal with biomimicry a little bit more every day, and the opportunities that might exist to grow a building. I'd like to get your thoughts on that, and then I have a question for you about something that you raised before we actually started the call. So first of all, what are your thoughts, I suppose, on biomimicry and growing materials?
It's Bill McDonough who always talks about that everything that we produce should either end up as a technical or a biological nutrient. If it's organic, it can go back into the soil or back into something, that's organic, or if it's metal or other thing, minerals, that it should be able to be recycled back into those same things. And that's really the most fundamental aspect of biomimicry, is that nature doesn't waste anything. And I actually think, and this gets a little bit away from your materials question, but I actually think that the biggest driver of both climate change and our future quality of life on this planet is waste. Every day we throw away half of the food we produce on this planet, half, and goes to waste. And we throw away, entire millions of barrels of oil every day that we've gone to great lengths to get. We throw it away in the form of plastic and then go out and do it again. We cut down forests to grow soy to feed to cattle to get a hamburger, and then we throw away the wood. And the list goes on and on. And the technology exists now to turn 90% of what we throw away into one of those biological or technical nutrients that can then become products, building materials, other things, feedstock for industrial products and so forth in the future. 90%. And yet we still are throwing stuff away in developing countries, not even in a controlled landfill. So I do think that using that technology, getting that more distributed around the world, will give us the opportunity to innovate more in terms of recycled content and acting more like nature in terms of using those materials, and thinking about the kind of planned, instead of planned obsolescence, maybe it's planned destruction, where things are made of more natural materials and they biodegrade, or, again, this is more of a topic for an expert like you in architecture and materials, but I think we haven't begun to scratch the surface. Look at how many buildings are still stick built, with a carpenter who measures and cuts and, puts up a frame and all that kind of stuff. Very inefficient. We don't build cars that way. We don't build furniture that. Nowadays, everything has some sort of automation, which increases the efficiency, not to mention what the materials are. So I think that especially in buildings, we're probably going to get it into more standardization and modularization. And like I mentioned about the floating cities, where those can be modular and repurposed easily. It's an area that is maybe, of all of our industrial and business activities, the most ripe for opportunity to innovate and accelerate change.
Yeah. In keying off what you were saying, in our practice, and it's a bit of an iterative process, because it's not like we can reach out or reach off to a catalog and find products and systems, materials that can be reused easily, can be converted to something else. There's so much more to making that happen. But what we aspire to is a time when we are not using up resources, but in fact, we're looking at the planet as something that we actually have this relationship with, which we always did. But we come back to respect that through how it is that we create place to live and work and play. But it is a bit, step at a time. It's not an easy thing.
It also gets into where those places are. You mentioned Texas, and I recall that during Hurricane Harvey a few years ago, that seeing reports that the damage was in areas that had been drained of wetlands and turned into, residential neighborhoods and so forth. And in fact, they were talking then about, after the devastation of that, of trying to maybe reclaim some of those lands and turn them back into wetlands, because that provides a natural buffer. And with sea level rise, many of those places would experience, as you said, more frequent flooding events anyway, and really not be habitable. So I think we make a mistake when we fight nature instead of learning how to live with it, not only in terms of our materials and how we heat and cool our homes and so on and so forth, but the area, the space around it, and how we live with nature.
Absolutely. I grew up in the 1960s in New Orleans and lived through a few hurricanes there, of course. And you very quickly appreciate that there's an environment around you which is most of the time protecting you. Of course, New Orleans had levees, which they needed to be able to live there. But when you degrade that environment, then you're really worsening things enormously. And that's what happened in Katrina, and that's what happened. Miami, of course, has felt that. New York and the East Coast with Sandy all felt that.
Mm-hmm.
All of these communities are now realizing that they have to have a plan for an environmental plan for how do they recreate an environment around them that's going to help to buffer this worsening weather. So you mentioned something, I want to come back to it before we got on the screen with each other, and that was hydrogen. And I'm curious what it is you're seeing with hydrogen right now.
Well, hydrogen, as many people may know, is the most abundant element in the universe. It doesn't normally occur on Earth, though, as a separate gas, although they are finding some deposits in Australia and Western Africa now as they look further. But mostly it doesn't occur like methane. Natural gas comes out of the ground from formations. And hydrogen is a little harder to find. Basically, today, most hydrogen is made by putting steam through natural gas, and then it breaks out the hydrogen and the CO2 and such. So it's based on a fossil fuel. But hydrogen can be produced with electrolysis, meaning you can take, let's say, solar panel electricity, put a little electricity into seawater or wastewater, sewage water, and break the hydrogen out. Because again, as everyone knows, it's H2O. H2 is hydrogen and oxygen. Mm-hmm. So you break out the hydrogen from the oxygen, and you can get this amazing gas, which can be used to power our cars, our homes, and especially heavy duty things like ships. And that's why we're interested at AltaSea, because battery powered electric vehicles are fine for light duty, but when you get to the heavy duty trucks and ships and so forth, you can either move batteries or cargo, but not both. And the batteries get too heavy, too large, etc., and take too long to recharge. Whereas hydrogen takes very little time to refuel. It's like refueling a gasoline car or a diesel vehicle. And the hydrogen is turned into electricity on board through a fuel cell. So people often mistake battery cars versus hydrogen cars and think the two are different. They're both electric cars or trucks. It's just that the way of storing the energy on board is either in a battery or in a tank of gas, which gets converted to electricity. So we think that there's a real opportunity at AltaSea to be a catalyst for the transition to a hydrogen economy in the marine environment, in particular in goods movement. And so we're looking at taking some of that solar energy I mentioned before that's going to come off our rooftop more than we need, and using it to electrolyze seawater or even wastewater from our nearby sewage treatment plant that otherwise would get dumped into the Pacific Ocean. Yes. Valuable resource. And demonstrating how you can get hydrogen out of those things and then put that into hovercraft. There's a 75-passenger ferry boat that's coming down from Seattle that just got Coast Guard certified that'll be here in the summer. So on our campus, we could power that boat on one side of our campus and then trucks on the other side, and demonstrate how the goods movement ecosystem can go from sea to land or back again, all on clean hydrogen. And then, of course, it's also a great way to store energy. People are looking at batteries to store intermittent renewables like solar and wind, but batteries degrade. Anyone who parked their car at the airport for a couple of weeks and comes back and it doesn't start, you know what I mean. But hydrogen doesn't. You put it in a tank or you keep it in liquid form, and it'll still be just as valuable when you come back weeks, months, years later. And so it's a great means of storing intermittent energy as well, which is something we want to demonstrate here.
So we're really getting to know the energy cycle, so to speak, in all new ways.
We have to.
Yeah. Well, what and thank you for so much. And you've talked about AltaSea and what it is that's happening with AltaSea, but what are some of the events or programs that are coming up? This is the beginning of May. What do the next few months look like for AltaSea in terms of coming to see you?
Yeah, the next few months are really exciting because we're just putting out the bid package for renovating our warehouses. And so by the fall, there's going to be a lot of hammering and sawing and dirt flying around here. We're very excited about that. But we're always doing open houses. If you check our website, which is www.altasea.org, that that there's always events, open houses every 2 months. We just did one on hydrogen actually a couple months ago, and then we did one for Earth Day with a speaker from one of the local marine aquariums talking about the ecosystem that we're all trying to preserve. And exciting ones coming up. And during Fleet Week here at the end of May, working with the Navy, they're going to be doing an event here, and many of our tenants do events here. So the best thing I can say is check our calendar online, and certainly swing by at any time and watch these 100-year-old historic warehouses that have served as a submarine base in World War I, and a staging area for the Marines and the Navy in World War II, and moved a lot of interesting cargo in and out over the years, now become the engine that will drive the blue economy into the future.
They really are. They really are fascinating buildings if you're into that sort of thing, and I clearly am. I love it. I've been in your buildings, as you know, and you know, the history that's there is apparent in good ways. And yes, you're doing work to bring it forward into the next generation, but so great what you're doing, and such a great place. And thank you so much for the time today. I'm
thank you.
Always fascinated to hear what you have to say.
Really appreciate all the work that you're doing, and you know, it'd be easy, I'm sure, to just sit back and keep doing what you were doing when you first got into this industry, and that's not what's going to make life better on this planet. And so I really appreciate architects like you that see the future and are trying to invent it in new ways. Or as Shakespeare said, nature's bequest gives nothing but doth lend. And so when nature calls thee to be gone, what acceptable legacy canst thou leave? Well, I think what McTigue Architecture is doing is a legacy that even William Shakespeare would write poems and plays about if he were alive today.
Wow. Terry, thank you. That was an honor. I was actually secretly hoping you'd have a Shakespeare quote to share with us today.
Well,
thank you so much.
Thank you.
And I hope to talk to you soon again.
You bet.
Take care.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thanks very much for watching. If you found it enlightening and interesting, then please like the video with your thumbs up. Please also subscribe to the channel to be notified of future episodes.